Welcome to the Grief as a Language podcast. I am your host, John Wright. And on today's segment, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Shirley Wright. Those paying attention to the details, I have to confess up front that the name similarity there is not coincidental. Dr. Wright happens to be my aunt. Moreover, she happens to be one of my favorite people on the planet. So when there's a discussion to be had about any topic, she's always near the top of my list or at the top of the list of people I want to talk to about it. Dr. Wright, welcome.
Thank you, John, and thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. I remember when I first um, approached you about the podcast and approached you about being on the podcast. I think your response was something like this. Well, John, I'm no expert on the subject of grief, but I'm certainly open to doing an interview. And I appreciate the fact that you are open to doing it. I'm not an expert either, Shirley, on this topic. What I think we both bring is our lived experience of having lived with and through loss. And one of the purposes of this podcast is just to be a place where people can talk about. I've talked with a lot of people through grief, families in my life and in my previous jobs, but I don't know that I've spent much time talking about grief. And so I wanted to have this podcast serve as a place where people can talk about what they remember, what they experience, what it was like for them. And so um, that's what we'll do here, if it's all right with you.
That is okay.
Excellent. So tell me a little bit about when I asked you about being on the podcast, and I didn't ask you specifically about people you had lost in your life, but I know there have been some. In fact, I've been around you long enough to know there have been many. Can you tell me and tell our listeners something about what you thought about when you decided you would do this podcast and who you thought about when you decided to do it?
Well, naturally, you start thinking about those people who are really close to you,
Yeah,
and people who had an impact on you
right.
when you experienced grief. So I started trying to remember things that were recent, but naturally, those things that really came were those things that happened a long time ago. And then this morning, all of that changed because I first thought about when my mother passed away, and that was really, a long time ago and many years ago. And I
How old
thought
were you,
about
Shirley? How old were you?
25
Okay,
when it happened. And of course, you don't expect to lose a mother at that age.
right.
And it was unexpected. And at the same time, I think I had some preparation for it. But during that time, I experienced three losses around the same time. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, passed in July that year. Then my mother passed in November. And then my great aunt, who's more like a grandmother to me, passed in January. So in a 6 month time period, I actually had experienced three losses. And then I started trying to think about a loss that was recent. And so I thought about my brother who passed away in 2019. And then I thought about Mr. Hayes, who has been like a surrogate father, in that I went through his death with Mrs. Hayes and so forth, and he passed in 2022. So I started thinking about all of those things. But then, as you say, life has lots of twists and turns. And so, believe it or not, this morning around 7:35, 7:40ish, my phone rang, and I tried to answer it on my watch, but it didn't pick up. And so it was my cousin, and I was giving Mrs. Hayes her medicine, and I told her, uh, I'll be right back. I need to call my cousin because he doesn't ever call me this early in the morning. So I called him right back and he said, cuz I know I don't call you this early in the morning. He said, but I called because dad passed at 7:05 this morning. And
Oh,
his dad is my last living uncle.
oh,
And when he
sorry to hear
said
that.
that, yes, when he said that to me, it's like that was the last thing that I was expecting to hear on a Monday morning,
Right.
the beginning of the week and that sort of thing. And so I expressed my apologies, said, let me know what you need me to do, da 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 da, that kind of thing. And then later in the morning, another cousin called wanting to know if I knew about my uncle and so forth. So I got to experience it firsthand this morning to see, how do you really feel about that? And because he is my last living uncle, oh, to even make it even clearer, you remember when you were here for Charlene's memorial service
I
that
do.
weekend?
Right.
And you and Petit came back from Marshall, and I had gone to a party. And when I came in, I said I had to go to a birthday party,
Right.
and it was my aunt's birthday party. And so at that birthday party, it was my aunt's birthday, but then her sister came in from California. My uncle lives in Dallas. And so the three of them were together, and they are my mother's last three living siblings. So, to experience that kind of thing after, and that was the last time I saw him was at the party
I remember
last.
sitting at your dining room table. You showed me a picture of him.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, that's the uncle who passed away.
Uh,
And so it just kind of hit me unexpected, not knowing that he had even been sick. I knew that he had some issues, but I didn't know that it was bothering him.
yeah.
And my cousin even said, well, he came in from the hospital and we thought he was going to be okay. And this morning he was taking his treatment. I don't even know what kind of treatment.
Right.
He said he was taking his treatment and he just didn't make it through. And I'm thinking, oh my God. And so all those memories of,
Right.
when I saw him last, the
Yes.
fact that I had planned to see him, but with DJ being here this summer, I just hadn't made it by his house.
Right.
But you just start thinking about all of those things. So I've experienced it today with lots of emotions, sadness, regrets that I didn't get by to see him, regrets that nobody called me to tell me that he was in the hospital, because if someone had called to say he's in the hospital, I would have gone by to
Sure.
see him. So it's that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
then we can't take back those things that have
Of
happened.
course.
So
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I mean, given the sort of scope of this interview, I would respectfully request that you tell me when I get to one of those questions, um, who it is you want to talk about. I mean, you can talk about any one of those persons. You had your mother and your grandmother and your great aunt, and then your brother, and then Mr. Hayes. Our audience doesn't know Mr. Hayes. We'll make sure they do before we
okay.
finish, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. And then now the uncle. So if I ask you a question about any one of about any area that we discussed in our pre-programming discussions, you just let me know who it is you'd like to respond. And when you do respond, let me know who it is you want to talk about. For example, my first question to you, what is your earliest memory of your loved one? Uh, Let me know who it is you want to talk about. And you just tell me, you guide the interview in that sense. What is your earliest memory of your mom? I'm going to ask specifically about mom because that's a person that I don't know.
That is true because when you knew me, she had already passed
Right.
away. And
Yeah.
so I guess childhood memories would
Yeah.
be things that I remember most because that's the person with whom I lived and experienced lots of things. So I one of the things that you know about me is that I spend quite a bit of time in the kitchen cooking for family and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I always wanted for Andrea, even when Artist and I divorced, I never wanted her to think that the divorce had anything to do with her, but I didn't want her to think that things would change, like meals at the table together and going out to eat together and those kinds of things, or even special dinners for special occasions. So I didn't want her to miss out on any of those things. So that's one of the earliest memories that I have of always being in the kitchen with my mom when she was cooking. And that's how I actually learned how to cook. I'd say, I'll help you, tell me what I need to do. And so, I know that as a cook myself, I know it's easier to do it myself, but she would say, well, you just do da 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 da. So
Yeah.
I learned how to cook just by being in the kitchen with her or asking. And even when I went away to college and would come home, it was still back to the kitchen with, what are we going to have for this meal, or what are we going to do for this? And so those are things that I remember. And one of the things that I always wanted for Andrea, or even for guests who come to my home, you can attest to that.
Yeah.
Uh, I want I wanted to feel welcoming. And
Yeah.
so I always wanted, and I remember how I felt when I would come home from college and, the aromas in the house. I always wanted that same kind of feeling for Andrea, or when guests come to my home, I want them to feel welcome. So
Right.
it's not unusual that I would have something baking in the oven so that that aroma greets the person.
I can attest to that.
So so it's that kind of thing. And I think a lot of that came from just being in the kitchen with my mom.
Yeah. So I hear you saying that I have your mom to thank for all those amazing meals and desserts and combinations of the two that I've experienced with other members of the family over the years. Thank you for
and
sharing
and
that, Shirley.
yeah, and even as you think about that, I even think about Miss Norris, who
Mm,
was like Big Mama to Andrea,
yeah.
and being in her kitchen and doing the same thing, or exchanging recipes, or saying, when you come to my house, we're going to have da 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 instead of this, that kind of
Right.
thing. So it's been, I guess it's that food that connects families and builds a sense of warmth, a
Right.
sense of welcoming. I'm glad you're here,
Yeah.
and here's a way, and let's share a meal, let's share a
Yeah.
dessert, any
Just
one of
like
them.
all of the when I come to your house, and I just left recently when my daughter and I were in Texas, all the senses are engaged. It's like when you walk in the door, there's always you just always done that, always been something cooking. I didn't know that about your mom.
Mhm.
That is wonderful to know. Um, when you think about funny memories of one or more of these persons that has passed and that you have felt grief around. Talk to me a little bit about memories that make you smile in either of those buckets.
I could actually pull some together.
Mm.
So the uncle who passed
Yes.
today always talked. I mean, he was a talker,
Yeah.
and he always had something to say. And so when my brother decided to get married, and this is an artist is involved in this.
Yes.
Artist and I were married at the time, and we
And
were
For
living
for
in
for our listeners, artist is my uncle, whom Shirley married. So that's going to make sure they get a little context.
right context so that you'll understand. So artist and I were married, and it's when we were living on Grove rather than on
Yes.
Price.
Hmm.
And my brother was getting married. He was in the military. He was in the Marines, and he was stationed in Beaufort, South Carolina.
Hmm.
And he decided that he wanted to get married on St. Patrick's Day, and he wanted to get married in my backyard. And if you remember the side,
I
well, you
do.
probably don't
I
remember, the
do.
side of that yard had the beautiful St. Augustine
Yes.
grass and all of that. But then by the
The
time,
side opposite the garage.
yes,
Yes.
yes. And so he wanted to get married at my house in my yard. And so we agreed that that would be okay.
Right.
And for some reason, well, there are a lot of reasons, but I can't go into that. You
Sure.
wouldn't have enough time.
Okay.
But long story short, the wedding was like at 7 o'clock in the evening, and we moved it from outside to inside because it was a little brisker than we anticipated. So we moved it inside. And around noon that day, my brother came and delivered flowers, and his bride to be had stayed at our house,
Okay.
and he had stayed with my sister. So, bride and groom aren't in the
Mm-hmm.
same location.
Right.
So around 12 noon, he delivered flowers. And around 4 o'clock, I'll say. Now, remember, I gave you a time frame. Around
Right.
7 is the wedding.
Mm-hmm.
Around 4 o'clock, my younger sister called and said, Shirley, what are you doing? I'm getting ready for the wedding. She said, well, what's Artist doing? He's doing something else, getting ready for the wedding. She said he needs to stop what he's doing and go to the airport and pick Nathaniel up around 6. Pick Nathaniel up around 6.
Wedding's
He,
at 7.
the
The
wedding's at
airport's in
7. What do
airport
you
is in
mean?
a different
The
state,
airport,
right?
the airport is in Shreveport. He was
Right.
go to the
Louisiana.
airport in Shreveport. She said, I don't have time to explain it all to you, but just tell Artist he needs to go to the airport and
Right.
pick Nathaniel up. I'm like, I've got to get details, but at any rate, I'm getting ready for a wedding. Around 6, relatives start
Mm-hmm.
showing up. And my uncle is one of those relatives, and he's asking 20 questions because we're stalling now. Where's Nathaniel? Long story, I can't give you all the details, but he'll be here by wedding time. Well, why is he not here? What's he doing? What? But Uncle Billy, just do you want something to drink? Do you want something to eat? What? No, I need to know, where is that boy? Why isn't he here? And he's just going on and on,
Right.
asking 20 questions. I've got other guests now starting to arrive, and my brother is still not here. Then we find out that the plane is late.
Mm.
And so he's going to be late. I've got
Yeah.
all these people in my house. The bride to be is asking, where is my brother? I can't give any answers because my sister had upset him, and he had decided to not show up for the
Yeah.
wedding. And
Changed his mind.
then he realized what he was doing,
Yeah.
and he turned to come back. So he had flown to Atlanta, but then was flying back to
I see.
Shreveport. So that uncle, 20 questions, and I'm trying to calm everybody down. I'm
Right.
trying to offer drinks and all of that. But the wedding did occur probably around 8 or 9 o'clock that evening. But that's, and when you start, I can't make you see how funny it was.
I can see it.
But
Imagine it.
if you think about all the questions that he's bombarding me with, and I'm
Yeah.
trying to calm guests, I'm trying to calm him and trying to get him to stop asking questions because I
Right.
really can't answer most of the questions that he's asking. So
Right. And
that's the kind
that was Uncle Billy.
that's Uncle Billy.
Uncle Billy. Very
Passed
good.
away this morning at
Right.
7:05.
Wow. Now, it's a great story, and it is a funny one. Those of us who are from the South can imagine some of the nuance there that doesn't fit
Right.
into
I
words.
didn't give you all the
Doesn't fit
questions,
into
but
words.
yes,
Yeah,
but you can fill it in the blanks.
absolutely, absolutely. So now, when you think about Shirley, the just your day-to-day life, which one of these persons, grandmother, mother, great aunt, brother, Mr. or Mrs. Hayes still alive, or the uncle, which one of those persons you think had the most impact on your day-to-day life as an adult?
It would still be my mother
Your mom?
because
Yeah.
yeah, just the way she was always calm, the way she was always the stabilizing force in the family, the way
Mhm.
she was always the go-to person whenever there was a crisis in the family. She was the person that everybody depended on.
Mhm.
I even remember my Uncle Bill and I used to work on the family reunion together. And that was a result of my mother having done that.
Yeah.
When I was a child, she was the person who did all the arrangements for the family reunion and so forth. So
Yeah.
she's always been a stabilizing force, but always supportive of whatever I was doing.
Yeah.
So, you know how you get that support from family,
I
always
do.
believing that if we continue to encourage you, everything will go well. So,
Right.
always that stabilizing force, always the go-to person, and not just for me, but for all members of the family.
Yeah.
If, like I said, crisis situation, my mother was the go-to person. And I guess my uncle realized that, and I became his go-to person. Like whenever he needed to have a question answered,
Yeah.
he called me. Oh, you need to stop by here on your way from work. I need to talk to you about, you
A,
know.
B, or C. Yeah.
Yes. And he's always the one who's always making sure that you remember how your ancestors made sure that you had land.
Yeah.
So his thing was always, have you paid your taxes yet? Did you pay the taxes? And because we still have property in East Texas, he's
Mhm.
always, have you paid the taxes yet?
Yeah.
It's
Ownership,
time.
ownership
You know,
mattered to
right.
him. Yeah.
It's time to pay the taxes. So yeah.
Right. What
And
was the
again, that came from, my mom having
right?
done it with him and
Yeah.
my grandfather and all of those persons.
Right. Now, this is one of those odd questions that maybe should or should not be in an interview like this, but I'm asking it anyway, regarding Uncle Billy or your mom or others. What do you remember the last thing your mother said to you? The last thing you heard her say, words from her mouth.
Believe it or not, I do because she actually passed on a Monday,
Hmm.
pretty much like my uncle.
Okay.
But I was teaching in and and living in Terrell,
Okay.
so just outside of
Yes.
Dallas.
Mhm.
And it was Bishop's homecoming weekend.
Bishop College. Mhm.
Yes, college. And I had talked about going or trying to make a decision about going and trying to weigh that with going to check on her
Yeah.
because she had had some bouts of illness, but not anything that we thought was going to take her life.
Sure.
And so that weekend, I kept saying, well, maybe I'll come home. And she said, no, you go to your homecoming. I'm just fine. And you can come here next weekend. So I remember her being adamant about my not coming home that weekend
Right.
to do something for me instead. So
Okay.
that was the last conversation that we had. That was like a Saturday midday,
Yeah.
and Monday morning she passed.
Wow. And that's the last thing you remember hearing her say at
Mhm,
25 years of age. That was
mhm,
you at the time, right?
mhm.
What do
That's me.
you wish you've had a chance to say to your mom, Shirley, that you didn't get a chance to?
I don't think there was anything that
Unsaid?
unsaid because I always tried to let her know how much I cared about her.
Yeah.
I always tried to be active, proactive rather than having to be reactive.
Yeah.
So I don't think I left anything unsaid. I just, I guess I wish I had gone home that weekend, but we don't have any way of
Right.
knowing the path that's been set for us. And so even though in my mind, I thought that my not going was the right thing, I don't think she wanted me to see her. And I probably would have recognized that she was sicker than we thought she was.
Right.
So I was not supposed to be there because everything, every attempt that I made to go home,
Right.
it took me in a different direction. So I wasn't supposed to be there.
Right. Okay. Uh, what advice would you give a person, Shirley, who's dealing with a recent loss?
I'd say take one step at a time. Give yourself a chance to, if you need to cry, then cry. But not everybody is a crier. You know, some people deal with their grief not crying. But you need to give yourself the space to do whatever you need to do because you have to feel most comfortable with whatever stance you take. And you know that you can't rely on others to make that decision for you. You have to make it so that you feel comfortable.
Right.
I'd say that you need to give yourself time to come to grips with what's going on because it is a shock to the system. And I say that because the last thing I expected was a call this morning telling me that my uncle had passed.
Right.
And in that moment, you know, you always, sometimes when you're going through grief, people will say, child, I know how you feel. Well, not really, because
Right.
each of us grieves in a different way. And I know that that's important for anyone who's experiencing a loss to know that each of us is different and you have to be who you are
Yeah.
at that time and give yourself the space to do what you need to do so that you can be comfortable in your grief.
Right.
Because it's not something that's going to happen today and it goes away tomorrow. You know, grief continues because things will happen that you say, oh, that reminds me of.
Yeah.
So it'll take you back. And because of that, you know that grief is not a one-time situation. It's ongoing, and you have to learn how to come to grips with it
Yeah.
throughout that process. So it
Absolutely.
is a process, and it is one that someone can't give you a lesson in how to grieve.
Right.
But there are things that you can do always. Reading helps. You
Yes,
know how I feel about reading.
I do.
There are stories that help you to deal with that. We were talking about the fall of Freddie the Leaf and how it talks about the life cycle, the fact that death is a part of life.
Right.
And once we realize that, we can accept it much easier.
Right.
So I think that that too is a part of the process, coming to terms with that it's a path that we all have to take. Every one of us has to go through that. And so you look at the life cycle of a leaf and you realize that it's a part of, like from the beginning to the end, that
Right.
it's a cycle. And, I'm not sure if there's a thing called reincarnation, but there are times when you feel like, I think I know this person from some other time,
Right.
some other place. And I can even remember my last work experience in Carrollton Farmers Branch.
Yes.
At one time, my office was at the very back part of the building, of the administration building. And in my office, I had two windows. It was kind of like a corner office. I had a window to the south and I had a window to the west.
Yeah.
And then right outside my office door, there was a door that would allow you access outside of the building. And for, I guess, probably about a month or so, every morning there would be a big black bird that would come and peck on the door. And, you know, other people would hear it and you started thinking, does that bird know something about this building that we don't know? Did that person work in this building at one time and
Right.
has come back as a bird? You know, but it's that kind of thing that you think
Right.
about when
Mhm.
those kinds of experiences happen, because you're like, why would a bird come and knock on the back door
Consistently.
of a building
Right.
consistently?
Right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So it's that kind of thing that you begin to think about.
Yeah.
And again, I hadn't thought about that until you asked me that question.
Yeah. Did you at 25, your mother passes, I'm going to say suddenly. And did your priorities shift or change in any meaningful way, or did you recognize yourself as changing your priorities in any meaningful way?
I don't think my priorities changed. I think that there were times that I didn't really understand what was going on. You know how you know that play, Your Arms Are Too Short to Box with
Box
God?
with God. Yeah.
Okay. I had to have some
Yeah.
self-talk along those lines because, you know, I was 25, my mother passed at 51.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, why my mother, and I can remember a church member this is when I was a member at Bethesda,
Hmm.
and Mr. Monroe's wife passed, Anne Monroe, and she was a beautiful lady, played the organ,
Right.
sang, all
Hmm.
those kinds of things. And I can remember when she passed with pancreatic cancer,
Yes.
her husband he said, why Anne? He said, there are so many mean and hateful people in the world. Why would God take Anne when he could have taken some of them?
Yeah.
And so, I went through some of
Right.
those same kinds of questions
Right.
during that time. So I had to do a lot of self-talk that
Right.
I wouldn't get angry and bitter.
Sure.
And I had to recognize that my arms were too short to box with God and that I couldn't question his decision.
Right.
I had to accept and move on. And I think
Right.
that's probably one of the hardest lessons, to accept and move on, and then think about how our loved ones are about us. They don't want us to be sad. They don't want us to be unhappy. They want us to continue to live fulfilled lives. And so you
Right.
think about those things as you're moving forward so that you don't get bitter, you don't become angry, you don't lose hope, and you
Right.
don't lose sight of what your goals and what your vision actually is.
Absolutely. A great place for us to stop, I think, Shirley. Thank you again for making the time to join us on the Grief as a Language podcast today. It's been an honor for me as your nephew and friend to sit across from you for these few moments. To those who may be watching us, I would say to you that if you are walking through some of those dark days that Dr. Wright has just talked about, may you be encouraged. If that's your station and you're watching this, don't give up. Don't quit. Keep walking. And may all that is generous and kind in this world walk with you. My name is John Wright, host of the Grief as a Language podcast. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for joining us today, and we'll see you again.
Okay, and thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Until next time.